The Lions, with an aggressive move up to go get Terrion Arnold, gave up a third to go get the second best corner in the draft, or the number 2 corner off the board. And we think probably the first or second best corner in the draft. Doubled up a corner with Ines Rakestraw, the corner out of Missouri. For the second year in a row, the Lions probably have the biggest surprise pick in round 3 or 4. Last year was Colby Sorsdahl. This year, Giovanni Manu from the University of British Columbia. Then Sione Vaki in the 4th round, the safety/running back, Makai Wingo out of LSU, and guard Christian Mahogany from Boston College. 6-player haul here for the Lions.
Yeah, what's the logic in giving them a C? Why? I don't see how you can get that harsh with this class. Even if you're like, okay, Giovanni Manu is one of the biggest reaches of the draft.
Only
I hate
one
that
guy
pick.
gave a C. I mean, they were 11th in the composite. That's
right.
probably fair for where they should be.
I mean, even 11th feels pretty harsh. I'm simply asking how you get to a C from this class, right?
I don't know.
Even if you say Manu is a massive reach and therefore a terrible pick, it's offset by the steal that you get in Christian Mahogany in the 6th round, right? So even if that's your one criticism, it's a wash relative to one other pick, and then the rest of the draft looks good. So that feels ridiculous to me.
Okay, you responded to one guy. Most people liked the Lions draft.
Well, you don't know. He might be a really important person from Sideline Reporter / is Sideline Reporter.
So the Lions were sitting at 29. They traded up to go get Terrion Arnold. You had some thoughts on this from our friend Arif?
So
the trade up in the 1st round.
It's this interesting area now where, we've talked before in this podcast that data would say, and Arif Hassan has done a lot of work on this, that the data would say that there isn't such a thing as a steal in the draft in terms of relative to the consensus board is what all this stuff is judged by, right? Generally speaking, Arif has sort of done studies to say the consensus board is about as good as the NFL in predicting how good players are going to be in the NFL, right? So you can't just dismiss it when a team goes off the reservation, goes Mayock Gruden, and drafts a dude, 30 spots higher than the consensus board have. You can't just go, well, they think he's better, so it's cool. Because generally speaking, they're not right? The only way there isn't value in that is when like a plurality of NFL teams think the same thing about a guy. Then we can start having a conversation about, well, what do the NFL know versus what does the consensus board know? So generally speaking, there isn't such a thing as getting a steal in the draft relative to the consensus board. But there is such a thing as reaching relative to the consensus board. So if you go and do the Gruden-Mayock thing and consistently reach for players that the consensus board thinks aren't that good, you're going to do worse than everybody else. But if you just stop the slide of players that are falling, the same thing isn't necessarily true. Now, it does seem that that's not an absolute. And the higher up in the draft you get, the more that might become a thing. But obviously, the smaller the data set you're working with, so the thinner, the flimsier that conclusion is, right? So you can at least construct the argument, if you're Minnesota or Detroit, that when Dallas Turner or Terrion Arnold are falling in the 1st round, that trading up for a non-quarterback, which is generally one of those do not do things, the analytics would say, is actually a better move than you think it is, because we're talking about genuine potential blue chip players. So Dallas Turner was, I think, 8th overall, right, in the consensus board. Terrion Arnold was 11th overall on the consensus board. These were like top-end players that, for some reason in this draft, because of, a half a round full of offensive players to started sliding down the draft towards teams that probably didn't think there was any chance they were available when they were going to be picking. So Detroit did give up a significant amount to get Terrion Arnold. On the other hand, they came out of a draft picking at the bottom of the 1st round with a guy who was arguably the top corner in the draft.
So that kind of makes sense to me intuitively. The Raiders' reaches that you're talking about, it was like they took Alex Leatherwood, I think at 17 when he was at 40 on the consensus board. Right. So those are reaches in the 1st round that have not panned out well historically. And you're saying the drop, like when Troy Franklin drops, hey, maybe we missed something by calling him a fringe 1st rounder and he goes in the 4th. And historically that doesn't work out as well. I think part of it not working out as well is the idea that when a guy drops that far, he will have fewer opportunities. No matter what we think about Troy Franklin and how good he is, as a 4th rounder, he's going to have fewer opportunities than he would as a late first, early second.
Yeah, I mean,
that might be one of the variables in this whole thing.
There's a few things at play. There's that the lower down the guy drafts, the less chance he has to actually prove you wrong. There's also for a guy to get overdrafted, only one team needs to think differently, right?
True.
For a guy to fall, all 32 teams need to think he's worse than the consensus board is. And then the other element is, generally speaking, the extra information that teams know about a guy works in the negative direction as opposed to the positive, right? The selling point on a player is typically his on-field tape, which everybody has access to. The thing you don't know that is going to move his draft stock is actually it turns out he has a long criminal history that's been covered up, or the man's a drug dealer on the side, or everybody in his locker room hates him, or, all these things that are not necessarily out there in the public sphere. Those work against the guy as opposed to, propping him up. Like, nobody is taking a guy who they think has third round tape and plugging him in at 12 overall because it turns out everyone in his locker room thinks he's a swell dude. You know what I mean? Yeah. So those, I think, are things that explain why there isn't such a thing as a steal, but there is a reach.
So the Lions go up to get Terrion Arnold, which I think I want to talk about that in a second. Fits a need, and I think he's the first or second best corner in the draft. Unbelievable in man coverage. The greasy hips, as Chris Sims said. Very good. I think he can cover in the slot, cover outside. I think he's excellent against good route runners. From the Dallas's perspective, my draft theory is always draft the best players, and who cares what's on your roster. Dallas was fine trading down because I think they were going to choose from a tackle or two, and maybe even got their guy at 29 in Tyler Guyton. But I'm interested if Dallas actually just took Terrion Arnold, which doesn't fill an immediate need at corner. They have Deron Bland, they have Trayvon Diggs, they have Jordan Lewis. But I do believe over time, if you just keep drafting the best players, and I think Terrion Arnold's a much better player than Tyler Guyton. I know we're not talking about the Cowboys right here, but I'm just looking at it from that alternative. If you keep taking the best player regardless of position, I think it works out over time. But from Detroit's perspective, we've talked about this on the podcast quite a bit, their seemingly systematic approach to building the trenches, getting receivers, getting this offseason, they had Aiden Hutchinson. He needed help. They bring in Marcus Davenport. They bring in DJ Reader. They've got guys coming back off injury. The defensive line looks loaded now compared to where it was during the season last year. Corner was the only place where they've kind of stitched it together the last couple of years and played pretty good football despite, I think, being below average at the position. And now it looks like it could be a position of strength with Terrion Arnold and Carlton Davis and Emmanuel Mosley there on the outside. To go with Brian Branch, whatever you want to call him.
I also really like coming back in the second round, double dipping at corner with Ennis Rakestraw Jr. from Missouri, right? Because this is what the Lions deserve so much credit, I think, for the way they're building this team and handling all of these difficult evaluations and questions and how you team build and all the strategy, right? So they have looked at this and they said, whether or not they've done this consciously or subconsciously, they've said Terrion Arnold is an absolute stud, a dude we didn't think we were going to have a shot at. He's sliding. Let's go get him. Let's trade up 5 spots or whatever it was to go draft this guy. This makes sense. Even if but then they've also 1 round later, they've acknowledged we might be wrong. Like let's add some more depth. Let's add an insurance, a contingency to the fact that Terrion Arnold, we might have goofed. And actually, Rakestraw might end up being a better player anyway. Let's just get that insurance policy around later. It isn't crazy. So they have this sort of fascinating combination of confidence in their own ability to evaluate. They'll go and draft Jahmyr Gibbs at the top of the first, even though people think it's crazy. They'll take a linebacker in the first. They'll take these low positions of value because they think the guy is a superstar. But they also recognize, they recognize the fragility of all this, right? And they've done it in this draft. They've done it in previous drafts. Dan Campbell, right after the NFC Championship game that they could have, should have won, was like, we may never get back here, right? They have this acute awareness of just how fragile all this is and therefore how best to mitigate all of these risks that they take along the way. I can't say enough smart things about, or good things about how smart that is.
One more thing about the Lions and the trade up or say being more aggressive this year. I feel like they've balanced their aggressiveness in the draft the last couple of years. In 2022, they made a huge trade up to go get Jamison Williams, but they had the extra draft capital, so they picked 3 times in the top 46 in 2022. Aiden Hutchinson, Jamison Williams, Josh Paschal. Last year, we know that their first 4 picks all were major contributors, 4 picks in the top 45. So because they've had so many high draft picks the last couple of years because of the Matthew Stafford trade, I feel like they were able to go give up a third, to go get one player, right? So I feel like they've balanced volume last year, 4 picks in the top 45, Jahmyr Gibbs, Jack Campbell, Sam Laporta, Brian Branch, and then Hendon Hooker at 68. Balance that volume with, hey, go get one guy this year in Terry and Arnold.
Yeah.
And I think, so if you just go get one guy every year, I think over time you're going to be in trouble. But if you balance it and you diversify the portfolio a little bit, I feel like you can get away with that.
But it is worth pointing. I mean, it did cost them, to make that move. They gave up 73 overall, a third-round pick, a reasonably high third-round pick. So that got you players. I'll just read out a few names that were available at or below pick number 73 in this draft. Cooper Beebe got drafted 73 overall. Braylon Trice was the next pick. Jonah Ellis was a couple of picks later. Guys like Kalen Bullock, the safety from USC. Jermaine Burton was a pick 80 a few picks later. Roman Wilson, who we talked about being phenomenal value. Dominic Pooney, the guy that Renner loves and the 49ers ended up.
Right, so you're balancing one of those guys
right,
plus whatever you would have gotten at 29.
Exactly, yeah. So it's like in order to get Terry and Arnold, right, to stop that slide, to go get the guy that you didn't think was going to be available, you had to give up your chance of getting a guy like this in the third round and the player that you would have drafted at 29 overall. So I think I don't have a problem with the move. I think it's fine. But, I think it's worth looking at those players and sort of saying that wasn't an inconsequential move, right? That was a pick with real value that they consciously decided to throw into this in order to get Terran Arnold. That's how much they believe in him.
Sione Vaki, the safety, remember he played a little running back at Utah. I'll be interested to see if Ben Johnson does try to get Vaki involved in the offense. I don't think he's necessarily a special running back, but when you get him, he's a pretty good zone runner. And I think when you get him on the roster, are you stealing an extra roster spot? Are you stealing an RB3 type who can also double as a pretty physical safety? I think that's an interesting move there. And then I like Christian Mahogany, the 6th-round guard. They got him at 210.
Yeah. On
the consensus board, Mahogany was 101 by draft day. He fits the bill, too. I think he has a chance to start next year. If Kevin Zeitler, who's on a 1-year contract, I think Mahogany has a chance to start at right guard, maybe in 2025, a power guard that fits what the Lions like to do.
Yeah, absolute steal at that spot. And then Manu was the other fascinating pick because of how high they drafted him. 4th round, University of British Columbia.
Big bag of tools on the offensive line.
6'7"
tackle.
6'7", 350 pounds, who runs sub 4.5 in the 40. I mean, this is somebody.
What?
Yeah. Sorry, sub 5, not 4.5. That would be insane. Sub 5 second 40.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
I was going to say he should go higher.
Yes, no, that's the top 10 pick right there. Sub 5 second in the 40 at 6'7", 350. There were some there's been some videos and stuff of him working out and doing stuff on Twitter. He does look like a ridiculous athlete.
Can he jump out of a pool?
I haven't seen that.
That's when you know he's good.
Oh yeah, that's when you know. But anyway, it's a reach, but I think these international guys are starting to get drafted higher based simply off these tools. I mean, the Mailata effect, I think, has become real.
That's worthwhile.
People have decided, almost regardless of tape / lack thereof, if you get a good dude that's just a freaky enough athlete, obviously those guys don't belong in the first round, but you could probably draft them higher than you think.
Yeah, and I think 1 out of 10 might actually work out, but if you get the 1, the payout is well worth a day 3 pick. I assume they could have gotten Manu much later, though.
Maybe, but the way these guys have been getting drafted.
Unless they got a text from a GM that said,
that's what
"Hey, we're taking this guy. You better get him."
The way these guys have been getting drafted, I wouldn't be sure about it. There is also tape on the guy actually out there. Just we don't have it.